At the height of the Nintendo Wii's popularity, at a time when the console had come to represent the largest install base in the history of home video games, an increasingly vocal segment of Nintendo fans were logging into online forums and waging heated comment wars to broadcast a singular message: we want hardcore games on the Wii. A seemingly basic request to which Nintendo responded at the 2008 E3 conference: what if you could pretend to play the trumpet by holding a Wii remote against your face? It'll be just like Guitar Hero, but without all those pesky notes. That's what you all wanted, right? The Wii had broken every conceivable sales record largely by appealing to what was then referred to as casual gamers. Now, ultimately, the labels casual and hardcore are a false dichotomy that exists mainly to gatekeep the word gamer. To what end, I'm not sure. But giving the benefit of the doubt, what the term hardcore meant in this case was a first-person shooter where you could go online and shoot at other players while yelling swear words into a headset. Nintendo's priorities had shifted away from the established gaming audience, as it was understood in popular culture, at a time when the marketplace had become increasingly defined by annualized multiplayer FPS titles, namely Call of Duty. So in 2008, High Voltage Software announced a game that was tailor-made to help Wii owners win arguments on the GameFAQs forum. The Conduit was a graphically impressive first-person shooter for the Wii, developed from the ground up as opposed to being ported from another console, and with a focus on online multiplayer, something most Wii games weren't known for doing particularly well. Looking at this game today, it's so clearly modeled for a specific niche in the 2009 Wii software library that frankly its entire existence feels ephemeral. So in this video, we're going to look at the Conduit, why this game exists, what I thought of the game playing it today, and whether it ultimately did appease the quote-unquote hardcore gamers of its era. So without further ado, let's get into things. Cards on the table, while I was very much aware of the Conduit's release at the time, having been a serious Nintendo fanboy and a devoted reader of Nintendo Power, I somehow never actually played the game until I started working on this video. Which raises an interesting question: why am I still thinking about the Conduit all these years later? It wasn't necessarily a breakthrough in game design, it's certainly not a magnet for think pieces like The Last of Us or Portal, and it hardly gets discussed outside of novelty throwback channels like this one. So why are we here? And why are you watching? Before we can discuss the Conduit, we need to remember the way Wii games were being discussed in the first few years of that console's existence. Personally, while I wasn't a huge fan of motion controls, party games, or whatever Zumba fitness was, the Nintendo Wii was my console of choice because I loved Nintendo's first-party output, particularly The Legend of Zelda. I also loved the Virtual Console, and I'm pretty sure Mario Bros. 3 is my most played Wii game, and I don't even feel weird about that, since the Wii Remote held sideways is a pretty solid NES controller. Motion controls still weren't my favorite, they really still aren't today, but it was hard to play a game like, say, Super Mario Galaxy and stay cynical. Great games were being made, if mostly by Nintendo itself, so eventually I got on board. And this is the key to understanding a game like the Conduit, and why this video is on the longer side, is that a game like this can be hard to contextualize. If you know, you know, but if you weren't there, you might understandably be confused as to why the best-selling console of its generation, made by the company that everyone kinda loves for being the best game company, had so many people who owned it and were complaining about the lack of decent games. It sounds like a contradiction in terms, but the real issue, as many players saw it, was a lack of high-quality games by companies other than Nintendo. And looking at the list of best-selling Wii games, very few of them came from third-party developers. To be clear, other companies made some great games for the Wii, but this was overshadowed by a huge influx of very low-effort, cheaply made software that was most likely meant to trick people who didn't know any better into buying something called Chicken Shoot because it was on the shelf at Walmart and it was cheaper than Excite Truck. These games weren't hoping for strong word-of-mouth recommendations, and I think I can reasonably refer to the people who run these kinds of development houses as con artists. For every Mario Kart Wii, for example, it felt like there were over a dozen games like Eminem's Kart Racing, more so than other consoles. Did anyone ask for these games? Probably not, but they flooded the marketplace anyway. And they're still around today, even at Walmart, where I found this boxed copy of a download code for an obvious Crazy Taxi ripoff at a price point where you could just buy Undertale instead. But these kinds of shovelware are definitely less prevalent in stores nowadays than I remember them being 15 years ago. So there was definitely, around the time leading up to the Conduit being announced, this agitated feeling among Wii owners who might consider themselves hardcore gamers. The frustration was essentially that the console had a lot more potential than what we were seeing attempted by third-party publishers, both in terms of what the Wii's hardware was capable of rendering, as well as what the gaming public was ready to purchase. If one were to believe the editors at Nintendo Power or the chorus of rant YouTubers from the era, then perhaps there was a cross-section of Wii owners who wanted high-difficulty, graphically detailed experiences that could rival what was happening on PS3 and Xbox 360. And the arguments coming from Nintendo fanboys online were almost starting to make sense. Why couldn't a game like Call of Duty or Halo launch on the Nintendo Wii? After all, the Wii was at least as powerful as the original Xbox in terms of raw polygon output, with both consoles averaging between 10 and 20 million polygons per second, as well as having similar CPU clock speed. And while these certainly aren't the only determining factors in terms of what a console is capable of rendering, it stands to reason that the Wii should at least be capable of running games on the level of the first and second Halo, or even the Source engine, since that had an Xbox port. But for whatever reason, despite what was technically possible, a lot of Wii games looked like this. Highly questionable ports of existing games, often slightly older games, with the textures demolished to fit on the console, or games that were straight up just ports of the previous generation's version. In many cases, a multi-platform game for the Wii would actually be based on the PS2 port, as PS2 games were still being released well into the Wii's lifespan, and both consoles were considered to be underpowered. So this is the problem which the Conduit was hoping to fix. This game was released in June 2009, and in my opinion, this game is entirely defined by the marketplace into which it was released, and specifically how it promises a Wii game that could compete graphically with games from other consoles.
People walk by and they go, wait, that's the Conduit? That looks like a 360 game.
Yeah, it actually does look really good. I'm actually pretty impressed.
This was a game made to capitalize on the perceived lack of other shooters on the Wii, and to do so very transparently. Initial coverage of the Conduit, both during its E3 demos and its release the following year, quotes the development team as being extremely candid about their creative intentions. According to an article in the October 2008 issue of Nintendo Power, in a section covering that year's E3, High Voltage Software speaks openly about the Conduit's similarities in design and gameplay to the Halo series, which by that point had achieved the biggest entertainment launch in American history with Halo 3. And there was a huge focus on where the Conduit would hope to fit as one of the most technically ambitious first-person shooters in the Wii library. And at this point, I feel like we should pause briefly to talk about the kinds of technical innovations that were being promised, because I think the phrase good graphics is vague to the point of being completely unhelpful, and in fact, it might be one of my most hated phrases in the entire gaming lexicon. But it's also an important part of discussing the Conduit's release, so against my better judgment, let's talk about... We all mean a great many contradictory things by this seemingly basic phrase. Whether the game achieves photorealism to the subjective human eye, whether a game has a consistent art style, the raw level of detail in terms of poly count and texture resolution, whether the lava was too bright in Dark Souls, and countless other things. But then there's something slightly divorced from the game itself, which is the ability of a game's marketing department to turn behind-the-scenes technical information into cool-sounding buzzwords to sneak into magazine articles. Video games are, after all, enormously expensive endeavors that companies will approve based on estimated financial return. Will people buy this? And in particular, the big selling point for the Conduit was, in addition to the poly count and texture resolution being above average for a Wii title, something called dynamic lighting, a phrase often mentioned but rarely understood. This can be a tricky conversation because there's a very thin line between what a game console or engine are capable of doing for real, in air quotes, versus what the developers are able to simulate convincingly. The best games play sneaky visual tricks to seem more advanced than they actually are. So when it comes to dynamic lighting, if you're not a 3D artist, and specifically a 3D game artist, then you might not know what that means. Because it doesn't just mean really good lighting, and in some ways it's actually the opposite. Dynamic lighting is a technique for calculating a game's lights every frame, in real time, so things like objects and enemies cast real shadows as they move through a scene. It's also the only way to make a light source move, like a swinging lantern. Traditionally, a game's lighting is baked into the textures, which means the lighting is calculated by the developers on high-end computer rigs based on the placement of light sources and objects within a scene. This is what's called static lighting. The shadows are essentially painted onto the surfaces permanently, such as floors and walls, so that these calculations aren't being redone 60 times a second on the end user's machine and thus slowing down performance. What this means in the case of the Conduit is that the muzzle flash of a gun will actually illuminate the space, most noticeably in the game's narrow hallways, which is admittedly a very neat little effect. There's also flickering lights from time to time to help sell the apocalyptic feeling of the alien invasion. To give a very brief history of dynamic lighting, game engines in the early 90s generally couldn't do this sort of thing very convincingly, but eventually the Quake engine hits the market and dynamic lighting is all the rage. And the effect was particularly noticeable in Quake since that game is so dark and moody throughout the entire campaign that when you see a grenade explode and light up the room, it makes for a nice visual. Throughout the era of 5th and 6th generation consoles, developers could sneak 1 or 2 dynamic light sources into a game to spice things up, albeit with a huge hit to performance. In Donkey Kong 64, for example, this small handful of moving lights in this one cavern are widely understood to be the reason that game needed extra RAM via the expansion pack. So, was it worth it? Was this swinging light source in one part of the game worth the cost of bundling extra hardware in copies of such a popular release? Well, I'm neither a developer nor a marketing expert, so who knows. But I suspect that the dynamic lights went unnoticed by the majority of players, whereas the need for an expansion pack undoubtedly led to great confusion in rental houses and used game stores across the country. But again, I'm not an expert. And the reason this can be so tricky to talk about is that, while dynamic lighting may have been the hot new feature of the mid-2000s, its effects had already been simulated since the very beginning of gaming. In Mario 64, for example, there's a little Mario-sized shadow that follows him around on the ground to make it look like the sun is casting that shadow in real time. Of course, Mario 64 does not have dynamic lights, and in reality, it's just a picture of a shadow, literally a black circle texture, that follows underneath the player. And in my opinion, it totally works, not just as a clever bit of visual trickery, but also to help players gauge distance in a 3D space. Now keep in mind, it's not always about whether a game engine can do dynamic lights or not, everything just costs render time. And if you choose to put dynamic lights in a scene, that might mean sacrificing texture resolution, or the poly count of a model, or God forbid, having a lower frame rate. It's not always about right and wrong, it's about choices. And in the case of the Conduit, the simple answer is that they kept most of the levels very contained to keep overall poly count down, and most of the textures are noticeably low resolution when viewed up close. And because they made cuts in these areas, this allowed high voltage software to play around with lighting effects and depth of field effects. And they did this because at the time, it was a selling point to say the game had dynamic lighting. Making a Wii game with good graphics was the entire point, and the phrase dynamic lighting was the perfect buzzword to quantify that success. By contrast, it was less of a selling point to say our maps are really big, even though that's arguably what made Halo so unique, but I digress. The Conduit chose fancy lighting over map size and texture resolution. And so I return begrudgingly to the phrase good graphics. Whether or not a game looks good is a fairly amorphous and subjective question that is ultimately difficult for a marketing team to turn into sales figures. But for what it's worth, I think the Conduit is certainly a very competent looking product in terms of recreating the contemporary first-person shooter aesthetic on the Wii. The color palette, the overall tone, and yes, even the lighting. These things look an awful lot like Call of Duty, albeit at the cost of making something where the creative choices feel uninspired and generic. The Conduit was never meant to break new ground visually or create new types of environments players had never seen before. It was meant to bring a certain kind of existing gaming experience to the Wii library. And that, of course, brings us to... In addition to the good graphics, the Conduit was, to put it with a historically accurate level of hyperbole, bringing Halo to the Wii. And as you can imagine, Nintendo Power ate it up. High voltage software was throwing a bone to Wii owners, and that's exactly what a Nintendo-focused magazine was hoping to cover. But surprisingly, it wasn't just Nintendo fanboys who got on board. Outlets like IGN and GamePro were optimistic in how they spoke about this game in the months leading up to its release, and some even gave favorable scores after playing the final version. IGN's Matt Casamassina gave an 8.6 out of 10, which is a shockingly high score in retrospect, and GamePro's Tae-K Kim was slightly more critical and gave a 7 out of 10, although the text of the review itself is oddly generous, and even draws comparisons with GoldenEye, so on the whole, reviews were pretty favorable. Now, I probably would have loosely characterized myself as a hardcore gamer back in 2008, whether or not that label was true or if it ever existed to begin with, but I still didn't pick up the Conduit at release for a variety of reasons. So my experience playing this game actually occurs now in the bright fancy future, largely divorced from all the hype. I was kind of curious how a game like this would feel now that I'm an adult with all the consoles and enough disposable income to play whatever I want. And that's obviously going to influence my opinion on this kind of game. But either way, here's what I thought. The Conduit is a strange mashup of Call of Duty and Halo, but right off the top, I see a contradiction in what this game is taking from those two franchises and what it fundamentally seems to misunderstand about why people liked COD and Halo in the first place. For my money, Halo's level design is defined by wide open spaces and the sheer scale of the levels, whereas the Conduit is almost entirely played in narrow hallways reminiscent of the first Rainbow Six game. So as much as the online multiplayer was undoubtedly fast-paced and full of amusing mechanics, there was never that feeling of driving fast vehicles across a massive canyon, only to get hit by a rocket and go flying hundreds of feet in the other direction. It played more like Call of Duty, in which the environments were often houses, hallways, or large-ish spaces filled with obstacles. This type of level design is what famously enabled behaviors like camping, which became something of a signature of Call of Duty's online experience. Yet the weapons and the enemies of the Conduit feel much more reminiscent of Halo, but still with those standard urban environments, so it often feels like you're playing the world's least interesting Halo DLC. It's a very odd feeling. Graphically, the Conduit looks about as good as similar FPS games released around this time on other platforms. Gameplay-wise, the combat mechanics are perfectly fine, and the motion controls were responsive enough. Headshots are always that much easier with a bit of motion controls, as any fan of Resident Evil 4's Wii port will tell you. The levels are a bit repetitive, and there were more than a few scripted events that failed to activate during my playthrough, which I always hate because my initial assumption is that I missed a button somewhere and I'll scramble around the room endlessly until I have to give up and reload the save. And this happened more than once, but you can't really patch a Wii game, so this sort of thing is somewhat inevitable for a mid-range release. The most critical thing I can say about this game, and it's something we'll come to see in popular reactions of the day, is that it all feels generic. You shoot at government agents and aliens who honestly look like their models could have been ripped from any other action game. The levels often feel like the same few hallways and stairwells recycled over and over. It's not a particularly inspired world to begin with, and the lack of variety in the level design doesn't help. Sound-wise, the aliens yell like off-brand brutes from Halo, and the voice actors are doing their best to make all the human dialogue sound vaguely like popular action movie stars.
The president is in danger? We have to warn him.
And as for the soundtrack, here's the thing. I'm generally not a fan of background music that's just noise to fill out the soundscape, regardless of medium, and this game really falls into that category. It quite honestly sounds like one of those epic music scores stock CDs that we have in every post-production house, which are recorded to be used in as many kinds of corporate video projects as possible. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if that's literally where the music comes from. It's just that bland. But given the intent behind this game, the question then becomes, is it even a bad thing that this game feels so non-specific? After all, the goal of the Conduit is quite transparently to create a AAA-style shooter game for the Wii, to fill the devastating emotional void left by Halo 3 and Call of Duty. And more specifically, High Voltage Software wanted to create a Wii shooter that wasn't just a port, but where the visuals and environments were built from the ground up with the console's limitations in mind, and where the game's engine is very specific in this pursuit. The Conduit needed to feel legitimate, and that's a tricky thing. You can't make unique and memorable art while also trying to convince everyone that your work is perfectly interchangeable with what's already on the market. So to that end, I would argue that the Conduit is certainly a generic game, but that it's like that on purpose. And it's not my favorite choice ever, but hey, take it or leave it, I guess. It makes for the kind of game that nobody is really rushing to replay more than a decade later, and that's alright too. As I said earlier, a big part of talking about the Conduit is understanding the marketplace into which it was released. When they created this game, High Voltage Software wanted to make a Halo-like experience or a Call of Duty-like experience for the Wii. So the question then becomes, was there money in that? Could a hardcore action game released for the Wii with a focus on online multiplayer that's made by a third party be well received by the market? And the answer ended up being, it might depend who you ask. This was the part of my research where things got murky. A lot of the press release quotes from the publisher Sega made it sound like the game underperformed. But there was a sequel, and Sega came along for that one as well, so I don't know what to make of this. Did it make money? I don't know. The sequel came and went, and there was an Android port several years later, but most telling of all, the Conduit didn't necessarily open the floodgates for other multiplayer shooters on the Wii. The Call of Duty ports got more serious and started to match the mainline versions of the game a lot better, but at least in terms of money, it's unclear whether High Voltage Software's grand experiment was a real success. In researching critics' reviews of the Conduit at release, it's hard to ignore just how starved Wii audiences were getting for core game experiences like this. For example, when I was reading the July 2009 issue of Nintendo Power for their final review of the Conduit, I found a 2-page spread about an upcoming port of Super Meat Boy for WiiWare, a release which would end up getting cancelled largely due to Nintendo's harsh restrictions on file size for games uploaded to the Wii Shop channel. It was 40 megabytes, which is ridiculous. I had forgotten all about this era until I started doing this research, at which point all the memories came flooding back. The sense of disappointment that Wii owners experienced during these months is something I knew quite intimately, particularly as I was a big fan of Telltale Games at the time, and the Wii release of Tales of Monkey Island was notable for its absolutely abysmal performance, allegedly due to issues with file compression. Again, 40 megabytes. Which is all to say, the life of a Wii owner who was looking forward to high-profile third-party releases at the height of the console's popularity was one of sustained disappointment, just game after game of empty hype and bizarre technical issues. Knowing all that, unsurprisingly, the Nintendo Power review of the Conduit is very positive, earning an 8 out of 10, and with much of the review focusing on what the reviewer, Steve T, notes as the Wii's unrealized potential as a platform for graphically ambitious first-person shooters. No surprises here. It's less of a review in terms of consumer advice and more of a plea for other developers to follow suit. Now, obviously Nintendo Power is a promotional magazine from the perspective of the Nintendo Corporation itself, so there's no real incentive for them to dig any deeper and question a game that seems to be attempting positive things on Nintendo hardware. And again, looking at the rest of that July 2009 issue of Nintendo Power, other major releases they reviewed were an alternate, more cartoony version of the Ghostbusters video game based on a stripped-down port for the PSP and PlayStation 2, an extremely poorly made Indiana Jones game that somehow scored a 7.5 out of 10 here but was trashed almost everywhere else, and an obscure rhythm game called Let's Tap. I don't know much about that last game, but the title alone is incredible. Which is all to say, the Conduit released during a particularly thirsty time for the Wii library, and if I've said it once, I've said it 1,000 times. M&M's kart racing just doesn't have the complexity or thematic nuance I expect from a modern kart racing experience. In terms of negative reaction, perhaps the most famous was a scathing review from Yahtzee of Zero Punctuation, which was an animated rant series where the speaker reviewed video games in a hyperbolic, fast-talking way. His impressions are formed less on the game's significance as a Wii title and come largely from his frustrations as a traditional FPS fan playing a shooter with motion controls. That's really the bulk of his review. He didn't like using the Wii Remote to aim, which is totally fair, and he found the levels repetitive, which is mentioned in almost everyone else's review. However, in a surprising take, he also didn't find the graphics to be all that charming. He makes particular mention of the low-resolution skybox, which is a valid criticism, but oddly enough, his phrasing of this point kind of implies that he thinks most games don't use skyboxes at all.
I've seen better looking Wii games and even GameCube games. This is more on the level of a PS2 that someone's trodden on. I can't remember the last time I saw a game depict a skyline by painting one on a wall and erecting it a few feet away from the window. That's shit I'd expect from a Tex Murphy game, and
which, I mean, if we start getting into popular misconceptions around how games are made, then this video will be 6 hours long and consist mostly of yelling. Before I go any further, I feel like I should point out that this review seems to have struck a nerve with Nintendo fanboys of the day, and Yahtzee had to publish a follow-up blog post defending his complaints about the graphics. But for some reason, he doesn't actually have any material points to argue, and he instead talks about how 3D graphics are just generally weird. And I'm not sure what to make of this. It's kind of a bad post. But anyway, let's get back to his initial video. Yahtzee goes on to say that the Conduit was nowhere near the visual fidelity of a PS3 or Xbox 360 game, as other outlets had claimed. Personally, I think this statement is incorrect, but more important than evaluating the claim at face value is understanding this review in context. This particular argument in his video is obviously reactionary, and that's neither good nor bad, as this is the express purpose of popular communicators who also want to entertain. It's a rant channel, and reviews like his need to make big declarative statements that can lead into punchlines. Giving actual consumer advice is secondary. And that's okay. As well, his words are written for an audience who we can safely assume would have been quite familiar with how outlets were writing about the Conduit at this time, and the aforementioned hype leading up to its launch. All things considered, gaming journals were particularly generous toward the game's graphics, so if you're gonna have a hot take about the Conduit and say something memorable, then this is the exact hot take you need to have. For better or worse, hyperbole is the language of the internet. Nobody goes viral for saying Super Mario Bros. Has responsive controls and catchy music. If you're a creator online, then you probably want to say things that cut through the noise, and bold, declarative statements like his are a shortcut to doing that. In terms of other negative feedback, I found that even the most positive reviews were critical of a gameplay mechanic called the all-seeing eye, a nod to the story's focus on Washington conspiracy theories. It's a ball thing that lets you scan for invisible items or blow up invisible aliens or hack computer terminals. Basically, it does whatever context-sensitive gimmick the game needs at that particular moment. But as far as the mechanic itself, I can understand why contemporary game journalists complained about this. The all-seeing eye slows down the flow of gameplay and forces you to explore what are essentially just empty rooms, but not in a way that encourages legitimate curiosity or lets you discover cool things, but rather I found myself hugging the walls, going back and forth throughout whatever room it was, listening for the Wii remote to make a sonar sound effect that would tell me where the button was. Worse yet, some critics felt that it was still underutilized by the developers, only being needed in a select few places in each of the game's relatively few levels. It's a questionable design choice to be sure, but here's the real question: why did the Conduit need an extra gimmick at all? You can't make a game Halo with a twist while also trying to make a by-the-numbers shooter for the Wii. There doesn't have to be a twist, it's Halo for the Wii! These competing goals clash pretty heavily in a few places, but most overtly when it comes to the all-seeing eye mechanic. And that's basically it. So we had a few laughs, killed a few aliens, and maybe, hopefully, learned a little bit about what the world was like in 2009. All things considered, the Conduit is a game that is so defined by the circumstances surrounding its release, so specific to a moment of hype, that any discussion on the game itself is impossible to separate from what High Voltage Software intended for it in the most concrete, marketing-focused way. From what I gather, the developers didn't come up with a game idea and then decide to make it for the Wii, but rather they saw an opening in the marketplace and decided to create a game that would appeal to the increasingly vocal group of Wii owners who wanted a little slice of what they were seeing on other consoles. So that's what they did. And it's probably true that nobody would have noticed this game had it come out as an Xbox exclusive or on PC. The fact that this came out on the Wii was something that differentiated it from, say, Halo 3, purely in terms of sales. And to be honest, the more I looked into this game and the more research I did for this video, the more I wondered, did the perceived gap in shooter games actually exist? Specifically, I was surprised by the degree to which the Call of Duty games were not only present on the Wii, but that they also supported online multiplayer. The way in which the Conduit was written about in magazines like Nintendo Power, I always assumed it was, if not the first multiplayer shooter on the Wii, then at least the first decent one. But this just wasn't the case, and in some respects, that makes a game like the Conduit feel unnecessary, since its identity is so devoid of anything unique, anything to make it stand out from other games of this era, that its entire existence feels defined by an imagined lack of similar games on the platform. So it's honestly a bit weird to discover that Call of Duty was doing multiplayer on the Wii a whole 2 years before the Conduit, and maybe that's why this thing wasn't such a runaway success. But either way, that's what I thought of the Conduit for the Wii. I must say, it wasn't the most fun I've ever had playing a video game, but it did look nice, and I suppose that's the whole point of a game like this. So, should you play the Conduit? Honestly, I don't recommend it on merit, but as you've probably gleaned from watching this video, the Conduit is certainly an artifact of popular culture, and if that kind of thing interests you, then this game is a case study in late 2000s Nintendo fandom like no other. It doesn't emulate well, performance was choppy on Dolphin even on a high-end gaming rig, not to mention how you'll need to hear audio cues from the Wii Remote speaker to get through the levels, which I would assume can be difficult to emulate. So it's definitely the kind of game that needs to be experienced on original hardware. But no, it's not really fun to play. Thanks for watching this episode of Computer Lab. Hopefully this was a welcome trip down console wars past. I'll see you in the next video.